This trail had become a sort of escape for me. It allowed me to escape the chaos of my life for a bit. Losing my wife, my parents, my child, all in 1 year. I just couldn't take it anymore. The air was so sharp on this crisp autumn morning, and it felt like the wind would slice through my skin if it had the chance. I know I shouldn't start my track on the Pacific Crest Trail at the beginning of August. It's just too close to the winter months, but at least the cold was a reminder that I was alive. The forest towered above me in ancient pines that seemed to stretch only forever. Shadows painted the trail, moving subtly as the forest breathed. I was going to do it this time. The entirety of the Pacific Crest Trail. I was ready. I had felt uneasy since the moment I entered the forest. The trees towered over above me, their wiry limbs weaving together to form a canopy that obscured my view of the sky. The scent of muddy earth and rotting foliage was thick in the air and started clinging to my clothes, and my chest grew heavy as it fought to take in the damp air. The ground beneath my boots was soft, almost spongy, as if the forest floor was rotting away beneath me. Even the wind seemed to be afraid to blow through the trees. The entire forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I had known isolation would take over my mind. I'd even looked forward to it. But now, as I'm standing alone in the depths of the forest, this solitude felt different. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, heavy. It felt like a lead blanket had been draped over my shoulders. The changes around me were subtle at first. It started with the gradual darkening of the forest that seemed to happen earlier and earlier each day. Typically of these later months, the sun would hang high in the sky, but the light that filtered through the trees was dim, almost sickly as it cast long shadows that twisted and stretched as if they had a life of their own. Trees around me were gnarled, and as I walked further through the trail, they seemed to lean closer, their bark rough and splitting like the cracked skin of something diseased. After a few days, I started to hear a faint whisper. It was barely audible, but it carried through the wind, dancing around my ears. I thought it was just the breeze or maybe a squirrel rustling through the leaves at first, but there was something just so unnatural about it. I felt like there was a mist full of secrets dancing around me. I tried to ignore it. I really tried. I wanted to just chalk it up to my imagination, but it kept growing, and it kept following me. Then there were the footsteps. I was camped near a small clearing, the canopy above parting just enough to reveal a sliver of sky. I had pitched my tent by a creek. The gentle lapping of water was comforting to the otherwise eerie silence, but as the darkness thickened, I was jolted awake by a sound just beyond the thin walls of my tent. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, too heavy to be an animal. My heart raced as I listened. Every muscle in my body tensed. My hand instinctively reached for my knife beside my sleeping bag. And the footsteps circled my camp, their rhythm unchanging. There was a steady crunch, crunch, crunch that seemed to draw closer by the second. My breath caught in my throat. I strained to keep quiet enough to hear more, but there was only the sound of those relentless footsteps. I wanted to tear open the tent and confront whatever was out there, but a deep primal fear kept me rooted in my tent. I sat in the dark, too terrified to move when the footsteps finally stopped. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, that someone was watching me. Something was waiting for me to let my guard down, but when dawn finally broke and I finally dared to step outside, there was no sign of anything. No tracks, no broken branches. There was nothing but the eerie stillness of the forest and the lapping of the water. The air around me felt even thicker as the forest was closing in. The birds were silent. The only sound was the crunch of my boots against the decaying leaves as I packed up my camp. Even the sunlight seemed dull and lifeless. The shadows turned everything into a muted grayish hue that made the forest feel even more alien. And then from then on, the days blurred together. Each one was more disorienting than the last. The trail, once a clear and welcoming path, began to twist and turn in unnatural ways. I would have been walking for hours and end up in places that I swore that I had passed earlier. The underbrush grew thicker. Thorny vines snaked across the ground, tripping me at every step. The trees pressed closer, reaching out their branches. They clawed at my clothes as though trying to drag me off the path into the dark, uncharted depths of the woods. I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel it. There was something that shadowed my every move, and every now and then I would catch the shadow of it in the corner of my eye, but it was just fast enough to never allow me to focus for too long. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing, just an empty forest. Vast and indifferent. The wind picked up as I hiked up a steep hill. It carried a foul odor that made my stomach churn. The smell was thick and heavy, almost rotting, like meat left to roast in the sun. I covered my mouth and nose with my hand, but it felt like the stench only grew worse the higher I climbed. It clung to me, soaking into my clothes and my skin, until it felt like with every step I breathed, it smelled of decay. I pushed through the smell, determined to get through this trail, when I stumbled upon an old campsite. The fire was nothing more than a blackened ring of stones, but buried in the ash were the shredded remains of a tent, torn to pieces by some wild animal. But it was the trees that trapped my eyes. Their bark had been gouged with deep, jagged scratches, each one welling thick, dark sap that glistened in the weak light. I ran my fingers over the marks. The wood was cool and wet to the touch. The scratches were fresh, and a low, ravenous growl vibrated through my chest, forcing me to pull my hand back. My heart sank to my stomach. It was a sound that would make anybody's blood run cold. It felt like something triggered something deep and ancient in my brain that told me to run, to get out of there before it was too late. But where could I run? The forest just went on forever. I was stuck in a maze of twisted trees and tangled underbrush that threatened to swallow me whole. But I started running anyway. My breath turned into ragged gasps as I barreled back down the hill. My heart raced as I watched the shadows, and my eyes grew wide, searching for any sign of movement. Then the growl came again, closer this time when something heavy crashed through the underbrush. The forest blurred around me as the growls grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was right behind me. I threw myself into a group of bushes that pushed me into a small clearing. My heart pounded through my chest, and I quickly turned, throwing my hands in front of me and gripping hard onto my knife. I expected to see something charging after me, but there was nothing. The forest was still, and the forest fell silent again, and the only sound was the thudding of my heartbeat against my ears. But I was still being hunted. I felt it in my soul. After slipping my knife back into my boot, I brushed myself off and kept moving. I had no choice, but I knew I had no idea where I was. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of rot clinged to everything. My only choice was to keep hiking the trail. I didn't get very far before I decided to call it a night. I figured I may not be far from whatever was chasing me, but would I ever be until I'm out of here? The footsteps returned that night, and I was too exhausted to even sit up. But they were different now, faster and more aggressive. They didn't circle my camp anymore. They darted back and forth as if trying to find a way in. I stayed in my tent, my knife held tight in my hand. I figured I was not killing whatever that was following me, but it would probably kill me first, and I wouldn't give it that victory. Every muscle tensed, and that's when the footsteps stopped. It was right outside my tent, the thin fabric separating me from death. I could hear its breathing, wet, rasping, struggling to draw in air. The smell of decay was overpowering. It seeped through my tent, filling my nose and mouth. I felt like I was drowning. But as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The night was silent again, but my mind was thick with whispers of the threat, and I couldn't stop wondering what was going to happen to me. I got some sleep that night. Between the exhaustion and pure adrenaline dump, I guess my body had finally given up. There was a small bundle of sticks arranged in crude circles at the opening of my tent. In the center was a single black feather. The edges were charred as if it had been pulled from a fire. I kicked it out of my way and hastily packed up my camp, my hands trembling. I wouldn't let my knife leave my body at this point. My sense of reality really began to slip more and more each day. I felt as if I were walking through a maze of twisted trees with shapes that seemed to writhe upon their bark and impenetrable shadows. The sun hung low in the sky when it appeared at all, casting everything in a sickly orange light. And the forest felt otherworldly, like a place outside of time. I don't know how long I'd been out there. Days bled together into a haze, each one more disorienting, disheartening than the last. Hell, I lost track of time, of distance, of almost everything except that thick forest's oppressive, smothering presence. My mind grew foggy. My thoughts started to become more laden and disjointed. It was as if I were wading through a thick, viscous swamp that slowed everything down. But it was louder now, the whispering. The constant buzzing that filled my head was really drowning out my thoughts. It no longer held the whispery tone it did on the wind, but was actually a cacophony of voices. All spoke at once, over the top of one another, filling my head with nothing but evil energy that made my skin crawl. There were times I could pick out individual words, but most of the time, it was all out of reach. It was during one of these moments, when the whispering was pounding through my head, that I saw the woman. She just stood there, motionless, a step or so in front of me along the path, blocking the center of it. All that raven black hair of hers hung down her back in tangled strands, still dressed in that plain white dress, though now grimy and torn in pieces, like she'd been running through these woods for days. I stood, frozen in my tracks, my heart pounding against my chest at the sight of her. "Hello?" My call echoed through this dense, oppressive silence. She didn't answer. She didn't move. She just cocked her head a bit to one side, as if she were listening to something that only she could hear. I advanced a single step, not taking my eyes off the woman. Something about her didn't feel right. It was almost as if my skin crawled with unease. I took another step and then another, until I could feel the pale, almost translucent skin on her arms. The way her fingers twitched slightly, as if she were fighting to hold still. "Hey, are you lost?" I asked, my voice shaking. Still, the woman didn't answer, but she began to turn, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were underwater. And when she finally faced me, my breath caught in my throat. Her eyes were open wide and hollow, her pupils dark and empty, like two wells without bottoms. Her face was emaciated, her skin was stretched tight over her skull, and her lips thin and cracked and dry. And yet, more than anything else, it was the expression that gave me a chill down my body. It was an insane maniacal grin, oozing from ear to ear and far too wide, with a forced smile, as though it were cut across her face. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing, my breathing coming in short, panicked gasps. The woman took another step closer, still smiling, her eyes locked onto mine. I wanted to turn, run, but my feet seemed to be rooted on the spot as my body was frosted into place by fear so intense it felt like it was suffocating me. And then the woman's grin broadened. Her lips began to crack open, showing rows of jagged, shattered teeth. Her hand shook as she reached out, the fingers curling into claws as she grasped at the air between them. And then she was gone, just as suddenly as she had appeared. The forest was empty, the trail ahead of me open and clear, as if she had never been there at all. I stood there for a long moment, digesting what lay before my eyes. Instead of whispering in my mind, there came now an almost deafening silence which pressed in on me from all sides. The trees of the forest thrust forward, mingling themselves with towering plants, and their reaching branches weaving into a wall of wood and leaves that were quite impassable. I ran, not knowing where, not caring. All that mattered to me was to get the hell away, to put space between me and that thing. The track twisted and turned, its surface was uneven. Roots and rocks hid beneath a layer of thick, dead leaves. I stumbled and fell, taking ragged gasps as my only breath while my heart pounded inside my chest like a drum. The trees seemed to close in still nearer, their boughs reaching out to hold me in my clothes, scraping on my face, as if to hold me and to drag me down into the depths. The air grew heavy and thick with the odor of decay, so awful that it pricked like needles at my eyes and seared in my throat. The whispering started again now, more loudly, a cacophony inside my head that utterly drowned my thoughts. I don't know how long I ran. I didn't know how far I'd gone, but eventually I burst out of the trees and into a clearing, my chest heaving, my lungs absolutely burning. That growl finally faded away, and the forest fell silent. But that sense of dread remained, its unbearable weight weighing me down, pressing in on me with an unrelenting force. I lay there for quite a long time, my mind racing and my thoughts jumbled and confused. My head seemed to be filled with the picture of the woman's face, with her wide, vacant eyes and her twisted smile. That feeling that I was going insane, that the forest was playing tricks on me, warping my perception, would not leave me. But deep inside, I knew what I had seen was real. The woman, the whispering, the forest, it was all real, and it was all interlinked. The forest was alive, sentient, and had a will of its own. A dark, malevolent force that was will-o'-the-wisping me, quite surely to the brink of madness. My thoughts turned to my family, my wife and children, whom I lost in my search for isolation and peace. I wanted to run away from them, find a place where I would be left to my thoughts alone, clean up my mind, and turn a new leaf. But now all I wanted was to be with them, to hold them tight, protect against the darkness that seemed to swallow me from all sides. Their faces were so vivid in my mind. Every line, my wife's warm smile, the children's bright, innocent eyes. It brought a tear to my eye, but only one fell down my cheek to hit the floor of the forest. And as it did, the picture in my mind began to shift and darken. My wife's face took on that same maniacal grin. Her eyes were wide and empty, her skin pale and translucent. The faces of the children warped, their features melted and distorted into unrecognizability, with eyes that were dark and hollow, their mouths seeming to be locked into silent screams. A raw, visceral scream tore from my throat and resounded in the trees. I clutched at my ear, fingers digging into my scalp to force the pictures out of my mind, but they wouldn't leave. They had been seared into my brain like a permanent scar that would never fade. And then the truth hit me like a punch in the gut. I was breathing, shaking. The woman on the trail, the twisted faces of my family, they all fit together. It was an interlocking that made my stomach churn with dread, and the more I thought about it, the more the pieces fell into place, and the more the obvious the picture they slowly formed became, one horrifying and yet inevitable. I had done something awful, something unforgivable. I killed them. My wife, my children, my whole family. I felt the feeling one gets when a fist is sunk into the stomach. Before my eyes, the vision flickers of lifeless bodies, their blood on my hands and on my clothes. I ran, trying to flee from my guilt, my shame, but the forced search for and returned me to the front. But as I realized with horror what I had done, another darker thought began to germinate in my mind. What if it wasn't me? What if there was another one out there? Someone who warped my memories, my thoughts, someone hunting me, just waiting for the right moment to strike. It was a terrifying and tantalizing concept, a speck of hope in my desolation. Maybe I wasn't the monster. Maybe the forest was. Maybe it used me. Maybe it manipulated me, fed off my fear and my guilt, warping my mind until I couldn't tell what was real and what was a nightmare. I clung to the thought, the possibility that I wasn't alone, that something else out there had been much worse than anything I could have imagined. It was an impossibly thin strand of hope, slim and desperate, but it was all I had left. I had to keep moving, to find a way out of the forest and away from that awful nightmare. I had to find the truth, to confront whatever was waiting for me out there. But as I got to my feet, shivering in my legs, mind still reeling over the revelation, there rolled through the trees a low guttural growl, which seemed to shake the very branches. It was the same sound that I had once heard before, that now chased me through the forest. Something big, hungry, and it was getting closer. I stood frozen, my heart thumping inside my chest, my breathing completely shallow. I didn't know what to do or even where to go. The forest was alive. The blackness was drawing tighter around me, and with it came another growl, louder this time, more insistent. And then I saw them. Two eyes alive with the dark, watching me, unwinking, unfeeling. They were the eyes of a predator, a hunter, and they were locked onto me, watching my every move. My mind went blank and my body acted on complete instinct. I whirled and ran, feet pounding the ground until the trees turned into blurs. The growl followed, gaining in volume, then in distance. It became the only thing left to hear and think. I don't know how long I ran, and I didn't know how far I'd gone, but eventually I burst out of the trees and into a clearing. The growl finally had stopped, and the forest was quiet once more, but that feeling of dread did not go away. An unbearable weight that felt like a press, holding me down and not relenting. It was a small clearing, ringed by trees, carpeted at the very base in a thick carpet of moss and dead leaves. In the center stood a small ramshackle cabin with rotting wood and a caved-in roof. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, if not decades. But I didn't care. It was a shelter, a place to hide and regroup, to figure out what to do next. Stumbling forward, my legs were weak, my mind still racing, and the dark, foreboding cabin loomed over me. But again, this was what was offered as an alternative. I went up to the door and pushed it open. The wood creaked at my touch, and the interior of the cabin was dark. Its air was stale. The smell of mold and decay permeated my nostrils. Every available surface of the walls was gouged deep with what looked like the markings of something big and powerful and sharp enough to splinter wood. My heart was pounding against my chest, and my breath came in short gasps. With the creaking of the door behind me, the cabin vented into darkness. My hands fumbled for my flashlight desperately, shaking wildly, and as soon as I turned it on, the beam of light illuminated a small, cramped space with the floor littered with debris and its walls filled with strange, indecipherable marks. I felt the cabin pulsing. It seemed to pulse with dark energy, drawing in my eyes and my mind and my thoughts. I felt as if it pulled me with the symbols that spoke to me, whispering out secrets in a language that I knew not, but which shook strong inside my bones. And then I saw it. A figure in the corner of the cabin, crouched low to the ground, its eyes glowing in the darkness and watching me. It was the same woman from the trail. Her smile twisted and still glued across her face. Her eyes were large and void of emotion, and her fingers now curling like claws. I stepped back, mindless and confused. The woman rose, heading slowly and confidently towards me, an unwavering smile on her face. Then she took a step closer and another. Her focus fell on me, with that look of insanity, her face twisted with malicious delight. Before I fell back, hitting the wall, my flashlight, with terrified shaken, shone erratically. The closer she came, the more her movements seemed slow and deliberate, as her eyes shined in the dark. And then, the moment she stepped a step ahead of me, she stopped. Her smile broadened, and those same lips pulling apart to show jagged, broken teeth from her mouth. And I screamed, but there was no sound. I could only stand there in horror as the woman's face began to melt away. Her skin, like boiling wax, burst its bonds and began a slow flow downwards, her eyes sinking into the skull, while her mouth stretched wider and wider until it was nothing but a gaping black maw. And then everything went black. I woke up, laying on the ground outside of the cabin, with just the sun rising. My head was pounding, my body ached. My mind was such a blur. I didn't know how I ended up there. I didn't know what had happened. But one thing I did know. There was blood on my hands, and the forest wasn't through with me yet.